All right, and now we're going to start with these 5 questions that you can see right here, okay, in your OneNote. Let's talk about these 5. I'm not going to go over them in great detail. I may mention parts of it, but a lot of this is for you to think. I don't know how many of you caught on to this or not. Those extended response questions are really grade savers. Because think, if I only had 20 questions, there were multiple choice, and there were 5 points each, some of you would never pass a test. Okay? That'd be bad. So those written ones usually are designed around, there is a way you can miss them, but really the intent here is for JD to be able to look at those and say, okay, this is what I think. Let me write this out. Let me do it in a detailed way, and that way Mr. Morris has enough to look at my grade and go, okay, that's pretty good. I mean, I may disagree, but as long as you support it, I'm fine. So let's look at these. All right, the first couple we'll actually talk about. This point of view greatly impacts how people feel about works of literature, and honestly, all works of writing. So you've got 2 main ones. There's a lot of breakdown. Let's make this as simple as possible. First person and third person. What if I'm telling it in first person? What does that mean? Yeah, I was there. Okay, I somehow participated. Third person would typically be I wasn't there, and I'm just telling it as like this disinterested observer. Okay, so this is told in first person. So my question is, how does telling this work in first person impact how we internalize or how we take it? Okay, so think about this for a second. If you're a lot of times when you're telling stories like this about a bad medical thing, like you can read a newspaper article about coronavirus right now, and it's usually in third person, and it gives you facts. It tells you how many people have died, how many people were sick, what we're doing about it. Now they give you that, but that doesn't really impact us that much because it's just numbers. Tell in the first person, I sat in the hospital with, I know you can't do this, I'm just using an example. I sat in the hospital with my grandmother as she was getting sicker and sicker. That impacts people a lot more. Why? Yeah, because that person was there. I mean, and it's not just about numbers now, it's about actual people. And so when we look at this story today, there's going to be this part where he talks about a specific person. That right there is what makes it emotionally impactful, okay? And that's a key to remember. Instead of this guy there are tons of newspaper articles and stuff about this plague, but to see somebody who's actually going through it's a different story. All right, second one. Generally, when discussing historical events, people lean more into informative language. Think about your history books. That's informative language. On such and such date, this, and this happened, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's informative language. It says, how does Defoe, that's the author again, break this with this tradition, and is it effective or not? So he's going to move away from informational and move more towards emotional writing. All right? There's 2, in my 11th grade AP class, we're talking about logos and pathos. All right, logos being logic, using numbers, using stats. Pathos being emotion. Emotion works really well to get people involved in what you're doing, all right? I could give you a list of all the concentration camps and the number of people that died in the Holocaust and what happened, or I can make a movie like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas and make everybody cry. One of those is a lot more impactful than the other. And it's not the listing and stuff. Because, guys, when we start talking numbers, when they get really big, it's really, we just go 6 million, 5 million. I don't know the difference. But when you look at that example of one person, what they went through, now it's got impact. So that's a really smart way to write. So those are the 2 we're going to kind of go over. These other 3 are going to be ones for you to think about yourself. Yeah?
You said he's going to move away from informational?
Yeah, towards emotional. Yeah. So third one, what purpose is there in writing about events such as this? I mean, this is a horrible thing. Why write about it? Same thing we were talking about the Holocaust. Why write about that? He says the people who lived through it probably don't want to relive it, and the people who didn't endure it probably don't want to imagine the misery of actually going through it. So who was this written for? Now, there's a really good answer. There's a really good reason we write for that. That's for you to think about. Okay, that's going to be a potential test question. Think about it. Why would we possibly want to do that? Number 4, how does the imagery of the pit at Aldgate help to promote Defoe's purpose? We'll see that. That's a majority of the stories about this big pit they dug to bury all these people in. Talk about how does that impact in what his purpose is. Finally, how does this show similarities with the plague, which we read or supposedly read during the summer? Oh, Mr. Morris, we're going to be in trouble if you use that one because I didn't read the plague. You were in class. We talked about it for 2-3 weeks. You should be able to make enough connections. If not, guess what? I'm going to make them as we read. If you're paying attention, you should have it. Okay? All right, that being said, let's look at page 591. $591 from a Journal of Plague Year. So it's not the whole thing. We're just getting an excerpt, but it's a really good piece of it, okay? All right, so 591. So we're going to start here. It's kind of in the middle of it. He's really building this entire. This isn't a very long passage. He's wait on the bell. Okay, he's building it around one particular event, and it's probably the most important imagery, and it's again of this mass grave where they're burying people in. When you think about mass graves, you think about like third world countries where people are, they just don't understand how this works, maybe, or there's a lot of people killed in a battle or something, throw them all in a pit. You don't think about this happening in the middle of London, one of the most civilized cities in the world at that time, and they're still having to bury hundreds and eventually thousands of people in the same giant hole. No funerals, no coffins, just, pushed all the bodies in, cover them up, the end. That's just not something that happens in our world. So that's what he chose, or our book chose that section to write about. Excuse me, let's see if I can keep my voice. It says, the face of London was now indeed strangely altered. I mean, the whole mass of buildings, city, liberties, suburbs, Westminster, Southwark, and all together, for as to the particular part called the city, or within the walls, that was not yet much infected. But on the whole, the face of things, I say, was much altered. Sorrow and sadness sat upon every face. And though some parts were not yet overwhelmed, yet all looked deeply concerned. And as we saw it apparently coming on, so everyone looked on himself, and his family is in the utmost danger. Man, you can update the language a little bit and put that from about this time last year, and it would make perfect sense. Think about that. Like, even though they hadn't directly been impacted yet, they could see it coming. And they started to worry about it. This part right here where he says, sorrow and sadness sat on every face. He says, yet all looked deeply concerned and saw it as apparently coming on. So, it's like everyone, even if it hadn't hit their family yet, they knew there was a good chance. And there was a lot of fear in their eyes. It says, were it possible to represent those times exactly to those that did not see them and give the reader due ideas of the horror that everywhere presented itself, it must make just impressions upon their minds and fill them with surprise. So here's part of why he writes it. He wants people to really see how bad it was. You can easily think about it. We can read an article about, when you talked about New York back midsummer, I think it was, or maybe a little later than this, towards the end of the summer, where they had, and even I know several other places right after Christmas, where they had to bring in refrigerated cars to keep bodies in when people had died because they didn't have a way to process them all right away. Telling you that story and then taking you to see it, that would be two different experiences. All right? So, or going to an actual place where you got a whole floor of a hospital with people that are on ventilators and suffering from this. That's a whole different thing than us reading about it. Or even if Tobias came and said, hey, I know somebody that was in there on a ventilator. That's sad, but to go and actually experience it, that's different. So that's why he's doing this. He says, London might as well be said to be all in tears. The mourners did not go about the streets indeed, for nobody put on black or made a formal dress of mourning for their nearest friends. But the voice of mourning was truly heard in the streets. The shrieks of women and children at the windows and doors of their houses where their dearest relations were perhaps dying or just dead were so frequent to be heard as we passed the streets that it was enough to pierce the stoutest heart in the world to hear them. Tears and lamentations were seen almost in every house, especially in the first part of the visitation. For toward the latter end, men's hearts were hardened, and death was so always before their eyes that they did not so much concern themselves for the loss of their friends, expecting that themselves should be summoned in the next hour. We saw that in the play. That right there, that mentality. Like the first half of this, when it first got there, people were really upset. Why were they not upset the second half of it?
Ain't nothing they can do about it.
Good, they got used to it. We're getting there right now. You see that with us? I've heard some of you say stuff like that. Like, I just wish we could get it over with. Not thinking about, yeah, you can say that and it might kill you. No, Mr. Morris, I'm young. Young people have died too. The odds aren't good, but, still, it could be you. And we just want to get it over with. Let's just get back to life the way it was, that sort of thing. That's kind of where they were. Now, they're not really saying the same thing because the mortality on this was a whole bigger deal than it is for us today. If you caught this, you probably were going to die. All right? But, the idea here, again, is they're so used to it at this point, and they also realize that I'm probably going to be next, so, they just kind of don't care. It built that says their hearts were hardened. It says, I went all the first part of this time freely about the streets, though not so freely as to run myself into apparent danger, except when they dug that great pit in the churchyard of our parish at Aldgate. So now we're getting into that first person. This guy's like, I traveled all over the town. I didn't put myself in immediate danger, but I started walking around, especially when you think about like one of these big churches in their city, and they said in the cemetery, in the graveyard there, they dug a huge pit. He says, that's when I really started to kind of travel around and go see this. A terrible pit it was, and I could not resist my curiosity to go and see it. As near as I may judge, it was about 40 feet in length and about 15 or 16 feet broad, and at the time I first looked at it, about 9 feet deep. But it was said they dug it near 20 feet deep afterwards, in one part of it, till they could go no deeper for the water, for they had, it seems, dug several large pits before this. For though the plague was a long a-coming to our parish, yet when it did come, there was no parish in or about London where it raged with such violence as in the two parishes of Aldgate and Whitechapel. I'm just going to point out something to you. You know what's unique about those? Not unique, but what makes those two special? They're where the poor people were. In those areas, there's less sanitation, more people per square foot or whatever. It spread more. So that, and of course, what was this plague spread by? Rats, the fleas off the rats particularly. And so, of course, these areas are going to have more of them. We saw that again in the plague. The poor areas are where you start to see it more and more. So I saw that they had dug several pits in another ground when the distemper began to spread in our parish, especially when the dead carts began to go about, which was not in our parish till the beginning of August. Remember, this started much sooner, but it got really bad in August. Into these pits they had put perhaps 50 or 60 bodies each. Then they made a larger holes wherein they buried all that the cart brought in a week, which by the middle to the end of August came from 200 to 400 a week. And they could not well dig them larger because of the order of the magistrates confining them to leave no bodies within 6 feet of the surface. And the water coming in on them about 17 or 18 feet, they could not well, I say, put more in one pit. So 50 or 60 bodies quickly turns into 200 to 400 in a week. Again, it's just dig the hole, bring the cart up, it goes through the streets, bring out your dead, whatever, they pile them all up, they get to this hole, flip it over and dump them all out. Move on. There's no funerals. There's nothing solemn or, somber about this moment. It's just dumping things in a hole. Like I told third period, I said, we go to more effort to bury our pets than they do. Some of us anyway. All right? It's a lot more solemn of a moment. And they're just dumping things in there like they're literally like it's garbage. That's basically the way they're acting. It says, but now at the beginning of September, in the plague raging in dreadful manner, and the number of burials in our parish increasing to more than that was ever buried, and any parish about London of no larger extent, they ordered this dreadful gulf to be dug, for such it was rather than a pit. He says the next hole they dug was so big you want to call it a pit. He wants to call it a gulf. I mean, this thing is massive. They had supposed that this pit would have supplied them for a month or more when they dug it, and some blamed the church wardens for suffering such a frightful thing, telling them they were making preparations to bury the whole parish and the like. But time made it appear the church wardens knew the condition of the parish better than they did, for the pit being finished the 4th of September, I think they began to bury the 6th maybe, and by the 20th, which was just 2 weeks, they had thrown into it 1,114 bodies. So they dug it for hopefully an entire month, so 4 weeks, let's say. You think 4 weeks, 300 to 400, let's say 300 a day or a week, that's 1,200. By 2 weeks, they'd already filled it up. Almost 1,200 bodies in there in that amount of time. Again, just imagine I know this is more of a picture that site. That's terrible. It says, when they were obliged to fill it up, the bodies being then come to lie within 6 feet of the surface. By the way, this is very disgusting, but I want you to think about this. They've got this has been going on for 2 weeks. They've been piling more and more dead bodies in there. Imagine living anywhere near this. They're not covering it up each night. So there's just dead, rotting bodies in your churchyard there, and they're going to keep going. And they were planning on leaving them there for a month, let alone for just 2 weeks. But still, I mean, that's just happening right there in the middle of the city. That's terrifying. So I doubt not, but there may be some ancient persons alive in the parish who can justify the fact of this and are able to show even in what place of the churchyard the pit lay better than I can. The mark of it also was many years to be seen in the churchyard on the surface, lying in length parallel with the passage which goes by the west wall of the churchyard, out of Houndsditch and turns east again into Whitechapel, coming out near the Three Nuns Inn. They're like, you could even still see where this pit was. I mean, even at this point later, going into that church and you're worshiping there, knowing what's right out there buried outside is just beyond frightening to think about. So it was about the 10th of September that my curiosity led, or rather drove me to go and see this pit again, when there had been nearly 400 people buried in it. And I was not content to see it in the daytime as I had done before, for then there would have been nothing to be seen but the loose earth. For all the bodies that were thrown in were immediately covered with earth by those they called the buriers, which at other times were called bearers. But I resolved to go in the night and see some of them thrown in. So they are throwing a little bit of dirt over them each night. So it's not just sitting there rotting, but still, I mean, it's not a very thick covering. It's still gonna smell, and you still know what's there, whether you see it or not. So he decides, I'm gonna go at night though. Why? Because he's creepy? Why go at night? Do what? Well, partially. Well, that's when they bury the bodies, actually, is at night. Because right, he wants to see it without just the dirt covering. He wants to actually see what it looks like. Because you're not going to do it during the daytime because people are walking around and stuff, and that's just a little bit too much. We're trying to hide it as much as possible. I mean, if you can hide, 400 dead bodies. So there was a strict order to prevent people coming to those pits, and that was only necessary to prevent infection. But after some time, that order was more necessary, for people that were infected and near their end and delirious also would run to those pits wrapped in blankets or rugs and throw themselves in, and as they said, bury themselves. I cannot say that the officers suffered any willingly to lie there, but I have heard that in a great pit in Finsbury, in the parish of Cripplegate, it lying open into the fields, for it was not then walled about, some came and threw themselves in and expired there before they threw any earth upon them, and that when they had come to bury others, they found them there. They were quite dead, though, not cold. Now, let's talk about this little phenomenon. What's happening?
People who know they're going to die are throwing themselves in the pit.
People that know they're about to die are going and throwing themselves in there. Why do that?
Wait, did somebody ask them to do that? Or,
Did somebody what?
like, did somebody ask them to do that? Or they just started?
No, they're doing that on their own. What'd you say? That's why. That's right. That's it, Tobias. It's so that if you stay at home, what's going to happen? Your whole family's going to get it. So these people are like realizing we're about to die, so they're going, and even if you realize that, to throw yourself in a pit full of dead bodies, and I mean, what a horrible way to end your life. I mean, this is a miserable, painful experience in general, but now let's add that on top of it. All right? So that's pretty bad, but that shows how much they care about their families. I would imagine not too far off, but it's not like I hit the ground and I'm out. So I imagine you're going to have to be there for a little, even an hour of that would be. I mean, I wouldn't want that to happen to my family, but I think I have to go out in the woods and die or something, not jump in a pit of dead people. That's a bit much. Yeah, I don't know if I could do this. He says, this may serve a little to describe the dreadful condition of that day, though it is impossible to say anything that is able to give a true idea of it to those who did not see it, other than this, that it was indeed very, very, very I love this writer here, professional writer. He's like, I don't know how to make it so that you understand. Just remember, it was very, very, very dreadful. Put the word very in front of it a few times. And such as no tongue can express. So he's saying, there's really no way to tell you how awful this truly was. He says, I got admittance into the churchyard by being acquainted with the sexton who, though he did not refuse me at all, yet earnestly persuaded me not to go, telling me very seriously, for he was a good, religious, and sensible man, that it was indeed their business and duty to venture and to, this sentence goes on forever, I'm sorry, and to run all hazards, and that in it they might hope to be preserved. So we'll stop there. That's kind of the end of the sentence. I know it's a semicolon. Sexton's kind of the guy who rings the bell, kind of like a church caretaker type thing. And so this guy, he knows him. He's like, hey, man, can I go out there and see the pit? And the guy's like, you really don't want to do that. He's trying to talk him out of it. He says, but that I had no apparent call to it but my own curiosity, which he said he believed I would not pretend was sufficient to justify my running the hazard. He's like, I just want to see it. He's like, that's a bad reason, because you can get sick too. So I told him I had been pressed in my mind to go, and that perhaps it might be an instructing sight that might not be without its uses. Nay, said the good man, if you will venture upon that score, name of God, go in, for depend upon it, it will be a sermon to you. It may be the best that you've ever heard in your life. He's like, well, I'll tell you what, you need to know how to get your life fixed. Go ahead and go see that, because you'll understand death in a way that nobody else does at that point. You'll appreciate your life then. A speaking sight, says he, and has a voice with it, and a loud one to call us to repentance. And with that he opened the door and said, go if you will. So he lets him in there, and pretty disturbed. He tries to warn him off. His discourse had shocked my resolution a little, and I stood wavering for a good while. But just as that interval, I saw two links come over from the end of the minorities, and heard the bellman, and then appeared a dead cart, as they called it, coming over the streets. So as I could no longer resist my desire of seeing it, and went in. So he debates not going, but then he hears and he sees one of those carts with the dead bodies coming up to the hole. And he's like, I want to go watch this. There was nobody, as I could perceive at first, in the churchyard or going into it, but the barriers and the fellow that drove the cart, or rather led the horse and cart. But when they came up to the pit, they saw a man go to and again, muffled up in a brown cloak and making motions with his hands under his cloak, as if he was in great agony. And the barriers immediately gathered about him, supposing he was one of those poor, delirious, or desperate creatures that used to pretend, as I have said, to bury themselves. He said nothing as he walked about, but 2 or 3 times groaned very deeply and loud and sighed as he would break his heart. So he also notices this weird guy in a brown cloak that's looking really upset, hanging around the pit, and they're like, oh crap, this is one of those guys that's about to throw himself in the pit. That's what they think anyway. When the barriers came up to him, they soon found he was neither a person infected and desperate, as I have observed above, or a person distempered in mind, but one oppressed with a dreadful weight of grief indeed, having his wife and several of his children all in the cart that was just come in with him. And he followed in an agony and excess of sorrow. So he's not a crazy person. Who is he?
He's grieving the loss of his wife.
Yeah, his wife and some of his kids are on that cart, and he was coming because, it's that whole feeling of like a funeral's about that closure for the people that are still alive. And these people are being robbed of that. They're not even having that because you're just having to dump bodies as quickly as you can. So he wants to come and see them buried, which, bad move, man. He mourned heartily, as it was easy to see, but with a kind of masculine grief that could not give itself vent by tears, and calmly defying the barriers to let him alone, said he would only see the bodies thrown in and go away. So they left importuning him. He says basically, look, just let me see my family get buried or put into the grave, and then I'll leave. But no sooner was the cart turned around and the bodies shot into the pit promiscuously, which was a surprise to him, for he at least expected they would have been decently laid in, though indeed he was afterwards convinced that it was impracticable. I say, no sooner did he see the sight, but he cried out aloud and unable to contain himself. I could not hear what he said, but he went backward 2 or 3 steps and fell down in a swoon. He faints when he sees the fact they're not like picking the bodies up and laying them in there. They're just flipping it up and bodies go flying everywhere. All right? And if that's one of your family members there, that's got to be just, impacting you on. Their death is bad enough. Now there's not even any dignity in death at this point. The barriers ran to him and took him up, and in a little while he came to himself, and they led him away to the Pie Tavern over against the end of Houndsditch, where it seems the man was known, and where they took care of him. He looked into the pit again as he went away, but the barriers had covered the body so immediately with throwing in earth that though there was light enough, for there were lanterns and candles in them, placed all night round the sides of the pit upon heaps of earth, 7 or 8 or perhaps more, yet nothing could be seen. So they take him to this tavern where he can kind of get better, but as soon as he does, he goes back out there to see if he can see their bodies. At that point, it's already covered up. He can't find anything. It says, this was a mournful scene indeed, and affected me almost as much as the rest, but the other was awful and full of terror. The cart had in it 16 or 17 bodies. Some were wrapped up in linen sheets, some in rags, some little more than naked, or so loose that what was covering they had fell from them in shooting out of the cart, and they fell quite naked among the rest. You've got 3 levels of wealth there. The ones wrapped in the linen would have been the more wealthy families. Then you've got somebody like this just in rags. That's like your middle class. And then you've got people who've got nothing. And that's your poor. And the point here is they're all being buried together. Once again, we've seen this in a lot of our literature, that death's the great equalizer. All these people, there's no separation at this point. Everybody's going in the pit together. The end. Doesn't matter whether you're the richest guy. Now remember, the rich are gone. But, still, there's still a lot of people there. Them or the poor, it doesn't matter. Everybody's getting the same treatment. But the matter was not much to them, or the indecency much to anyone else, seeing that they were all dead and were to be huddled together into this common grave of mankind, as we may call it. For here was no difference made, but poor and rich went together. There was no other way of burials, neither was it possible there should, for coffins were not to be had for the prodigious numbers that fell in such a calamity as this. Again, there's this lack of dignity at the end. Think about, if you've ever been to a funeral and it was open casket, people are buried, wearing either like something nice, or like maybe it's like, if it's a younger person, they loved baseball or something. Maybe they're wearing their favorite team's jersey or something. You don't put them in an open casket naked. I mean, that's, they're dead. Why does it matter? Because it's a respect thing for them and for the family. And they don't even have that here. And it's not because the people doing this are bad people. It's because it's coming so quick you don't have time for all the niceties that go with this. It's just too bad. I mean, that's what's tragic about this. That's when we're looking at these questions. That's why you write this. Let's be thankful that's not where we are. That sort of thing, to make us really realize how good we have it now versus what they went through. And by the way, not something that we could go through again. I mean, whether you want, coronavirus isn't turning out, we've turned out more deaths than what they've had, but we're also looking at a larger area. We're not just talking about one city. if we lost 100,000 people in one city, I don't know how much New York got up to, but 100,000 dead, that's a big number. I know more have died in the U.S., but the U.S. is a lot bigger than London. So let's not play with those numbers too much. But I mean, even that's a scary thought. All right? Okay, so that's the end of that. So we'll stop there. You guys got a few minutes left if you want to work the little writing part with this. A few sentences, guys. 5, 6. Just make them good. Tell me why you think this is useful today and why we should learn. Don't just write because of coronavirus. That's not what I mean. Explain why that should matter, because this is not the same thing. Like I said, the death rate on bubonic plague was if you got it, you pretty much were dead. Coronavirus, we've had several kids at school get it, and none of them have died. None of them were really, really bad sick. We've had a couple of adults that maybe got kind of sick and maybe even ended up in the hospital. But a lot of people, that wasn't the case. So this is a little different. So make sure you explain yourself. All right.